The night my father signed the papers that erased my name from the family business, he didn't even look me in the eye. He signed it at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done my homework as a kid, the same table where my mother used to slice birthday cakes and sing off. He signed it like he was paying a water bill, my name gone, 31 years of my life gone, with a single stroke of a fountain pen that my grandfather had given him. I stood in the doorway and watched, and I remember thinking that the sound of a pen on paper had never seemed so loud in my entire life. My mother sat beside him, arms crossed, refusing to look at me either. My younger brother, Daniel, the golden child, the one who could do no wrong, stood behind them with his arms folded and a smile he was barely bothering to hide. That smile is the thing I remember most. Not the betrayal itself, not the years of work I had poured into a company that bore our family name, but that smug, satisfied curl at the corner of his mouth, like he had just won a game I didn't even know we were playing. Let me back up, because you need to understand how we got to that kitchen table, how a family that once ate dinner together every single Sunday ended up in a war that would eventually cost them everything. My name is Claire, and I was 2 years old when I walked into my father's company, Whitfield Logistics, fresh out of college with a business degree and more optimism than sense. My father, Robert Whitfield, had built that company from nothing. He started with 2 delivery trucks and a dream, and by the time I joined, we had a fleet of over 200 vehicles and contracts with some of the biggest retailers on the East Coast. I didn't walk in expecting a corner office. I started in the warehouse, learning the business from the ground floor up, the way my father always said real leaders should. I worked there for 9 years before I ever sat behind a desk with my name on the door, and even then, that name only appeared because I had earned every single letter of it. My brother Daniel joined the company 4 years after I did, and from the very first day, the rules were different for him. He was late constantly, he missed meetings. He made decisions that cost the company real money, decisions that would have gotten anyone else fired on the spot, and yet every single time, my father found a way to excuse it. He's still learning. My father would say, "Give him time." I gave him time. I gave him 9 years of time, watching him climb faster than me despite doing less, watching him get credit for projects I had built from the ground up, watching my father's eyes light up every time Daniel walked into a room in a way they never lit up for me. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself that the work mattered more than the recognition, that eventually my father would see what I had built, what I had sacrificed, what I had given up to make sure Whitfield Logistics survived 2 recessions and a warehouse fire that nearly bankrupted us in my 5th year there. I was wrong. He never saw it, or worse, maybe he saw it and simply didn't care. The end came fast, faster than I ever could have imagined, and it came wrapped in a lie so absurd that even now, years later, it still makes my chest tighten with anger. Daniel had made a catastrophic error, one that cost the company almost $400,000 in a botched contract renegotiation with our largest client. Instead of owning it, instead of facing the consequences the way I had faced consequences for every mistake I ever made in that building, Daniel went to our father and told him it was my fault. He said I had approved the terms without his sign-off, that I had gone behind his back to sabotage the deal because I was jealous of his rising position in the company. It was a lie built entirely out of nothing, and it should have taken my father 5 minutes and 1 phone call to our client to disprove it. But he never made that call. He never asked me for my side. He simply believed his son, because that is what he had always done, and 3 days later, I was sitting in that kitchen watching him sign away 31 years of blood, sweat, and loyalty, because it was easier to blame the daughter who never raised her voice than the son who never took responsibility. What my family didn't know What none of them could have possibly known that night was that I had spent the last 2 years quietly building something they never saw coming. I had a mentor outside the company, a woman named Elena Ruiz, who ran a competing logistics firm and had been trying to recruit me for years. I had turned her down every single time out of loyalty to a father who, it turned out, had never once been loyal to me. I had also, without telling a single soul, been documenting everything. Every decision Daniel botched. Every meeting my father excluded me from. Every contract I had personally saved with my own negotiating skill, while my brother took the credit in press releases and shareholder calls. I didn't know yet exactly what I would do with any of it. I only knew, standing in that doorway watching my father's pen scratch my name off the company I had helped build, that this was not the end of my story. It was only the beginning. And within 18 months, the very family that chose money and blind favoritism over me would watch everything they built crumble into dust, and they would have no one to blame but themselves. I didn't cry until I got to my car. That's something people never tell you about betrayal, the way it holds you upright in front of the people who hurt you, the way your body refuses to let you break until you're finally alone. I sat in the driver's seat outside my parents' house for almost 20 minutes, gripping the steering wheel so hard my knuckles went white, and I let myself feel every single ounce of it. The humiliation, the rage, the strange hollow grief of losing something that was never really mine to lose in the first place, because if my father could erase 31 years with one signature, then maybe I had never truly belonged there at all. But somewhere in those 20 minutes, something else started to take shape underneath the grief, something colder and more useful. Clarity. For the first time in almost a decade, I could see my family exactly as they were, not as I had spent years hoping they might become. The first person I called wasn't a lawyer. It wasn't a friend. It was Elena Ruiz. She picked up on the second ring, and when I told her what happened, she didn't say she was sorry, and she didn't waste time telling me my father was wrong to do it. She just asked me one question. Are you finally ready to stop being loyal to people who were never loyal to you? I said yes before I even finished processing what I was agreeing to. 3 days later, I sat across from her in a conference room at Ruiz Freight Solutions, a company that had spent the last 5 years quietly eating away at Whitfield Logistics' market share in Mid-Atlantic region. Elena didn't offer me a job out of pity. She offered me a vice president title, full autonomy over client relations, and a compensation package that made my old salary at my father's company look almost insulting. I signed the contract that same afternoon in a building with my name still meaning something, in an office where nobody assumed I was less capable simply because I hadn't been born with the right last name attached to the right amount of favoritism. Word travels fast in the logistics industry, faster than my family ever anticipated. Within 2 weeks, 3 of Whitfield Logistics' longest standing clients had requested meetings with me directly, not because I had reached out to poach them, but because they had worked with me for years and trusted my name on a contract more than they trusted anyone else at my father's company. I want to be honest about something here, because this story only means anything if I tell it straight. I did not go looking for revenge in those early weeks. I went looking for stability, for a place to land, for proof that the years I had poured into that industry meant something beyond my father's approval. The revenge found me on its own because the truth was simple and undeniable. I had been the one holding Whitfield Logistics together for years, quietly smoothing over Daniel's mistakes, managing the relationships that actually kept the company profitable, and the moment I was gone, there was no one left standing between my brother's incompetence and the company's collapse. The first real crack appeared about 6 weeks after I left, when Whitfield Logistics lost its second largest client, a national furniture retailer that had been with the company for 11 years. I found out through an old colleague who still worked in the warehouse, a man named Pete, who had trained me back when I was 20, 2 years old, carrying clipboards and learning how a loading dock actually functioned. Pete called me not to gloat because he wasn't that kind of man, but because he was worried about his own job security and needed someone honest to talk to. He told me Daniel had shown up late to the quarterly review meeting with the retailer's logistics team, unprepared and dismissive of concerns they had been raising for months about delivery delays. He told me my father had tried to smooth things over afterward, but the damage was already done. The client didn't just leave. They left publicly, citing a decline in operational reliability, in a trade publication that every logistics executive on the East Coast reads religiously. My father's company, the one he had built from 2 trucks and a dream, was starting to bleed in front of an industry that had once respected him deeply. I felt something strange reading that article, not joy, not yet. Something closer to vindication, the quiet satisfaction of watching a truth finally surface after years of being buried under my family's favoritism. But underneath that vindication was something I hadn't expected to feel at all: worry. Not for Daniel, and certainly not for the way my father had treated me, but for the 200 employees who had nothing to do with any of this, warehouse workers and drivers and dispatch coordinators who depended on that paycheck to feed their own families, people like Pete. I knew from years of experience exactly how fragile a logistics company's margins really are, how quickly instability at the top can cascade into layoffs at the bottom. I hadn't set out to destroy anything. I had simply stopped propping up a structure that was never built to survive without me, and now I had to decide how far I was willing to let that structure fall, and whether there was still a version of justice in this story that didn't require watching innocent people suffer for my family's mistakes. That question would follow me for the rest of that year, because what happened next wasn't just the slow decline of a company. It was the beginning of a war between me and my own blood, one that neither Daniel nor my father saw coming, and one that would eventually force my mother to choose a side she had spent 30 years avoiding. My mother called me for the first time in almost 2 months on a Tuesday morning in late September, and I almost didn't answer. Her name lit up on my phone screen while I was walking into Ruiz Freight Solutions for a client meeting, and my thumb hovered over the decline button for what felt like a full 5 seconds before something in me, some stubborn leftover piece of loyalty I couldn't quite kill, made me pick up instead. Her voice sounded smaller than I remembered, thinner somehow, stripped of the confident, dismissive edge she'd carried at that kitchen table 2 months earlier. She didn't apologize. I want to be clear about that, because for a moment I let myself believe she might, and I felt that old familiar hope flicker in my chest before she crushed it in the very same breath. She wasn't calling to make things right. She was calling because she needed something. Whitfield Logistics had lost a 3rd client that week, a regional grocery chain that had been with my father since the company's earliest days, and she wanted to know if I would talk some sense into the people I now worked with, convince Elena to back off, to stop what my mother called poaching, our family's business. I remember standing on the sidewalk outside my office building, watching people walk past me with their coffee cups and their ordinary Tuesday mornings, and feeling like I had stepped into some strange alternate version of my life where none of this made any sense. I hadn't poached anything. I hadn't even called a single client since I left. They had come to me, every one of them, because they trusted my name more than they trusted a company that could no longer function without me. But my mother didn't want to hear that. She wanted a villain who wasn't her son, wasn't her husband, wasn't the family she had spent 30 years protecting at any cost, including the cost of her own daughter. "Your father built that company for you and Daniel both," she said, and I actually laughed out loud on that sidewalk, a short, sharp sound that surprised even me. "He didn't build it for me, Mom," I said. "He erased me from it. You watched him do it. You sat right next to him." She didn't have an answer for that. She just went quiet, and after a moment she said she had to go, and that was the entire conversation. 90 seconds that told me everything I needed to know about where I still stood in my family eyes, even as their entire world was starting to collapse around them. I didn't hear from my father directly for another 3 weeks, and when I finally did, it wasn't a phone call or a visit. It was the lawsuit. Whitfield Logistics filed a formal complaint against me and against Ruiz Freight Solutions, alleging that I had violated a non-compete clause buried somewhere in my original employment contract, one I hadn't even remembered existed because it had been drafted almost a decade earlier during a completely different phase of the company's growth, and one that, as my own attorney quickly discovered, had never actually been renewed or resigned after my role and compensation structure changed 5 years later. It was a desperate move, the legal equivalent of throwing a punch while already falling down, and I understood immediately what it really was. It wasn't about the non-compete clause at all. It was about control. It was my father's last attempt to prove that he still had power over my life, that even after everything, he could still reach into whatever I had built and threaten to take it away, the same way he had threatened and then followed through on taking away everything I built inside his own company. Elena wasn't worried. I remember sitting across from her in that same conference room where she'd offered me the job months earlier, watching her read through the complaint with an expression that was somewhere between amused and irritated, the way you might look at a mosquito bothering you at a barbecue. "This won't hold up," she said, sliding the papers back across the table. "But it's going to cost him a fortune to lose it." She was right on both counts. Our legal team dismantled the non-compete argument within 6 weeks, proving in court records that the clause had lapsed years before I ever left the company, and the judge dismissed the case with something close to visible irritation at having his time wasted. But by then, the damage to Whitfield Logistics wasn't just reputational anymore. It was financial in a very real and very public way. Legal fees, a visible, humiliating loss in a small claims filing that got picked up by the same trade publication that had reported on their earlier client losses. And worst of all for my father, an industry that was already starting to whisper about instability at the top of his company now had actual documented proof that Robert Whitfield was flailing, grasping at anything he could to slow down a decline that had started the exact same night he chose to believe his son's lie over his daughter's decade of loyalty. I want to tell you I felt nothing when I heard the case had been dismissed, that I had reached some enlightened place of detachment from my family's unraveling. That would be a lie. I felt something sharp and satisfying settle into my chest that day, something I wasn't proud of but couldn't pretend away either. But underneath it, quieter and harder to ignore, was the growing understanding that my father wasn't going to stop. He couldn't stop because stopping meant admitting he had been wrong, and men like my father would rather watch everything burn to the ground than admit that. And burning it down was exactly what Daniel was about to do next, in a way that would finally, irreversibly, tear our family apart for good. The story broke on a Thursday afternoon, and I found out about it the same way most of the industry did, through a group chat with 3 other logistics executives who couldn't stop sending exclamation points. Daniel had been caught falsifying safety inspection records for a portion of the Whitfield Logistics fleet, specifically 11 trucks that had failed routine maintenance checks but were still sent out on delivery routes with signed documentation claiming they had passed. It wasn't a minor paperwork error. It was the kind of thing that gets federal regulators involved, the kind of thing that turns a struggling family business into a criminal investigation almost overnight. One of the drivers, a man who had worked for my father for nearly 15 years, had refused to take one of the flagged trucks out on a highway route after noticing the brakes felt wrong, and when he raised the issue through proper channels and got brushed off by Daniel directly. He did what any reasonable person would eventually do after being ignored. He went to the Department of Transportation himself, with photos, with dates, with a paper trail that made it impossible for anyone to pretend this was some kind of misunderstanding. I sat at my desk reading the news alert with a strange, cold feeling spreading through my chest, because whatever anger I still carried toward my family, whatever satisfaction I had allowed myself to feel watching their empire crack, none of it prepared me for this. This wasn't about boardroom politics or wounded pride or who got credit for a contract renewal. This was about a driver who could have died on the highway because my brother cared more about hitting delivery quotas than about basic human safety, because Daniel had never once in his entire life faced a real consequence for cutting corners, and somewhere along the way he had internalized the idea that consequences simply didn't apply to him. I thought about all those years I had spent quietly covering for his mistakes inside that company, catching the things he missed, smoothing over the deals he botched, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel amid all this vindication: guilt. Not because I had caused any of this, I hadn't, but because I understood now with a clarity that made my stomach turn, that my years of quiet cleanup work had probably taught my brother that someone would always be there to catch him. I had left, and there had been no one left to catch him this time. The federal investigation moved fast once it started, faster than my father's lawyers could contain, and within 3 weeks, Whitfield Logistics had lost its operating certification for the flagged vehicles, a public relations disaster that made the earlier client losses look almost quaint by comparison. News crews showed up outside the company's headquarters. My father, a man who had spent 40 years building a reputation as a fair, honest businessman in an industry built on trust and long-term relationships, was suddenly the subject of local news segments with words like safety violations and cover-up attached to his family's name. I watched one of those segments alone in my apartment, my hand pressed over my mouth, watching my father walk past a cluster of reporters with his head down, looking older than I had ever seen him look, older than the last time I'd actually stood close enough to see his face clearly, back in that kitchen the night he erased me. Daniel wasn't in any of the footage. He had already stopped showing up to the office by then, according to Pete, who was now feeding me updates almost daily, less out of loyalty to me and more out of sheer disbelief at what he was witnessing unfold in a building he had worked in for over 2 decades. My mother called again 3 days after the news broke, and this time I heard something in her voice I had never once heard in 31 years of being her daughter. Fear, not the controlled, composed fear of a woman managing a crisis, but raw, unguarded terror, the kind that strips away every pretense a person has spent a lifetime building. She told me the company's insurance carrier was threatening to drop them entirely. She told me creditors were calling the house directly now, not just the office, because Whitfield Logistics had personally guaranteed several loans against my parents' own assets years earlier, back when the company was thriving and that kind of guarantee felt like a formality rather than a risk. She told me, finally, quietly, that she didn't know if they were going to lose the house. And then she asked me, in a voice so small I almost didn't recognize it as hers, whether I could help. I sat with that question for a long time after we hung up, longer than I've sat with almost any question in my life. Because here is the truth nobody tells you about revenge, about watching people who hurt you finally face consequences for the choices they made. It never arrives clean. It never arrives the way you imagined it would back when you were sitting in a parked car outside your childhood home, gripping a steering wheel and promising yourself that one day they would understand what they threw away. It arrives instead as a phone call from a frightened woman who is still, despite everything, your mother, asking you to save a house you grew up in, built by a company that had chosen to erase you rather than value you. And in that moment, I had to decide what kind of person I actually wanted to be on the other side of all of this. Not the daughter my family had discarded, not the executive quietly enjoying their downfall from a safe distance. Something else entirely, something I would have to build for myself, the same way I had built everything else in my life that had actually lasted. I didn't answer my mother right away. I told her I needed time to think, and I hung up the phone and sat in my apartment until the sky outside my window went from orange to gray to black, turning her question over and over in my mind like a stone I couldn't put down. Somewhere around midnight, I finally understood what was actually bothering me, and it wasn't the money itself. Elena had built Ruiz Freight Solutions into a company profitable enough that I genuinely could have written a check to cover my parents' most immediate debts without blinking, and some smaller. Softer part of me wanted to do exactly that, wanted to walk back into that house and be the daughter who saved the day, who proved once and for all that I had been the better child all along. But I understood, sitting there in the dark, that writing that check would solve nothing. It would just be another version of the same pattern that had defined my entire relationship with my family, me quietly absorbing the consequences of choices I didn't make, propping up a structure that had never once been built to include me as anything more than free labor and convenient blame. So I called my mother back the next morning, and I told her the truth as gently as I knew how to say it. I told her I loved her, and that some part of me would probably always love my father too, no matter what he had done, because that's simply how 31 years of history works. It doesn't disappear just because it should. But I told her I wasn't going to write a check to bail out a company that had erased me, run by a brother who had lied about me to protect his own failures, and a father who had never once asked my side of the story before signing away my entire career. I told her that if she and my father needed help navigating the legal and financial mess that was closing in around them, actual professional help, lawyers who specialized in exactly this kind of crisis, I would help her find the right people, because she was still my mother, and I didn't want to watch her lose her home over my father's pride. But I would not save the company. I would not pretend that the years of favoritism and dismissal had never happened just because the consequences had finally, inevitably, caught up with them. She cried on the phone, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let her cry without immediately rushing to fix it, because some things simply have to be felt all the way through before anyone can move forward from them, my mother included. 3 weeks later, I agreed to meet my father in person for the first time since that night at the kitchen table. He asked to meet at a diner near the old warehouse neutral ground, and when I walked in and saw him sitting alone in a booth by the window, I almost didn't recognize him. He had lost weight. His hands, when he wrapped them around his coffee cup, shook slightly in a way I'd never noticed before. He didn't launch into an apology, and honestly, some small part of me was almost relieved, because I don't think either of us was ready for the kind of conversation a real apology would have demanded. Instead, he told me the company was filing for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, that the fleet had been reduced by nearly 60%, that most of the warehouse staff, including Pete, had already been let go with severance packages that were smaller than any of them deserved. He told me Daniel wasn't speaking to him anymore, that some final, ugly argument had erupted between them once the full weight of the safety violation charges became public, each of them blaming the other for a collapse that both of them had actually caused together in their own separate ways over the span of years. And then my father said something I never expected to hear from him, something that had taken 40 years of pride and 31 years of a broken relationship with his daughter to finally arrive at. He said he had been wrong. Not wrong about one decision, not wrong about that single signature on that single night, but wrong about a fundamental, foundational way he had raised his two children, wrong about mistaking loyalty for love and favoritism for fairness, wrong about believing that the child who never complained must be the child who needed the least. He said watching everything collapse without me there to quietly hold it together had shown him, in the most painful way possible, exactly how much I had actually been carrying all along, and exactly how little he had ever acknowledged it. I didn't forgive him in that diner booth. I want to be honest about that, because forgiveness isn't something that arrives just because someone finally says the right words after doing the wrong things for 3 decades. But I listened. And for the first time since I was a little girl doing homework at that kitchen table, I felt like my father was actually seeing me, not the daughter he had assumed would always be there to clean up his messes, but a person who had built something entirely her own, entirely without him, and had survived it. I left that diner without any grand resolution, without the kind of clean, satisfying ending you might expect from a story like this. My father's company still ended up dissolving completely within the year. My parents did eventually lose the house, though not entirely, a negotiated settlement with their creditors that I helped my mother navigate through a lawyer I trusted, allowed them to downsize into something smaller but stable. Daniel, as far as I know, still hasn't spoken to me since that night at the kitchen table, still blames me somewhere in his mind for consequences that were entirely his own doing. And me, I kept building. I kept climbing at Ruiz Freight Solutions, eventually earning a seat at the executive table that had nothing to do with the family name I was born into and everything to do with the one I had built for myself, brick by brick, decision by decision, long after the people who should have valued me first chose money and blind loyalty over the daughter who had never once stopped showing up for them. It's been almost 3 years now since that night at the kitchen table, and I still think about the sound of that fountain pen scratching across paper more often than I'd like to admit, not because it still hurts the way it used to, but because I've come to understand it as the exact moment my life split into a before and an after, the kind of dividing line you don't recognize as significant until you're standing far enough away from it to see the whole shape of what came next. I run a division of nearly 200 people now at Ruiz Freight Solutions. Elena made me a full partner last year, and my name is actually on the door this time, not tucked away in some org chart my father controlled, not contingent on staying quiet while my brother took credit for my work. I built a career that owes nothing to the family that tried to erase me, and there is a particular kind of peace in that, a peace I never expected revenge or vindication to actually deliver, because it turns out peace was never really about watching Whitfield Logistics collapse. It was about finally, fully belonging somewhere on my own terms. My relationship with my parents exists now in a smaller, quieter form than it once did. I see my mother every few weeks, usually for coffee, sometimes for dinner at the modest 2-bedroom house she and my father moved into after everything settled. Our conversations are careful in a way they never used to be, both of us navigating around old wounds that never fully closed. But there is something real there, too, something honest that didn't exist back when our entire relationship was built around pretending Daniel's failures were somehow invisible. My father and I talk less often, maybe once a month, usually short calls that stay carefully on the surface of things, weather and health, and nothing that requires either of us to reopen what that diner conversation started. It's not the relationship I dreamed of as a little girl doing homework at that kitchen table, but it's honest, and after 31 years of a relationship built on my silence and his blindness, honest is worth more to me now than reconciliation ever could be. Daniel and I have not spoken since that night, and I've made a kind of peace with that too, though it took me longer than anything else in this whole story. I heard through my mother, in one of our careful coffee conversations, that he eventually found work at a smaller regional trucking company, starting from somewhere near the bottom, doing the kind of unglamorous work he had always avoided when our father's last name gave him a shortcut around it. I don't know if he's changed. I don't know if he thinks about that lie he told our father, the one that started this entire avalanche, or if he simply rebuilt a new story in his head where none of this was ever really his fault. I used to lie awake wondering about that, wondering if he'd ever call me, wondering what I would even say if he did. I don't wonder about it much anymore. Some relationships end not with a dramatic confrontation or a tearful reconciliation, but with a slow, quiet acceptance that some people will never be ready to own what they did, and that you cannot force closure onto someone who isn't willing to meet you there. If there's a lesson buried in all of this, and I've had almost 3 years now to sit with that question, I don't think it's really about revenge, even though I know that's the part of this story that probably kept you watching. It's not really about watching Whitfield Logistics crumble, or Daniel's mistakes finally catching up with him, or even my father's slow, painful reckoning with the kind of parent he had actually been. The real lesson, the one I wish someone had told me back when I was 20, 2 years old, walking into that warehouse full of hope and naivety, is this: loyalty that only flows in one direction isn't loyalty at all. It's just a slow, quiet form of erasure, and you can spend years, even decades, mistaking your own exhaustion for love before you finally understand the difference. I gave my family 9 years, then 20, then 31, believing that if I just worked hard enough, stayed quiet enough, never complained loud enough, they would eventually see me the way they saw Daniel without even trying. They never did, and the day I finally stopped waiting for that recognition was the exact same day I finally started building a life that didn't depend on it. I don't know where my father and Daniel would be today if that night at the kitchen table had gone differently, if my father had picked up the phone and asked me my side of the story before signing that pen across the paper. Maybe Whitfield Logistics would still exist. Maybe Daniel would have kept climbing, protected forever by a father who never learned to see his blind spots. Maybe I would still be there too, still quietly cleaning up messes that were never mine to clean, still telling myself that one day, if I just worked a little harder, they would finally choose me. Too, I'll never know, and honestly, I've stopped needing to know. Because whatever they lost that night, and they lost almost everything, I gained something they never expected I'd find on the other side of their betrayal. Myself, standing on solid ground I built entirely with my own 2 hands, needing no one's approval to know exactly what I'm worth. And if you're watching this because some part of your own story sounds a little too familiar, I hope you hear this clearly. You don't need them to see you in order to become exactly who you were always meant to be. Sometimes the greatest thing a family can ever do for you is finally, painfully, show you the truth of who they really are, so you can stop waiting for them to change and start building a life where you never have to wait for anyone's permission to matter again. I want to say one more thing before I let this story go, because I think it matters more than anything else I've told you so far. For a long time, after that night at the kitchen table, I believed my worth was something other people got to decide. I believed if I just worked hard enough, stayed patient enough, kept my voice low and my complaints quieter than my brother's mistakes, someone would eventually hand me the recognition I had spent 31 years earning. I waited for my father to see me. I waited for my mother to choose me. I waited for a family that had already made their choice long before that pen ever touched that paper, and the waiting itself became its own kind of quiet erosion, one I didn't even notice happening, until I was standing in a doorway watching my name disappear from a company I built with my own hands. If you take nothing else from this story, take this. The moment you stop waiting for people to finally see your worth is the exact moment you become free to build a life that reflects it. I am not going to stand here and tell you that walking away is easy, because it isn't, and anyone who tells you revenge or independence arrives without grief has never actually lived through losing a family, even a family that failed you. I grieved my father. I grieved the version of my mother I always hoped she could become. I grieved a brother I once genuinely loved before ambition and favoritism turned him into someone I no longer recognized. Grief and growth were never opposites in this story. They walked beside each other every single step of the way, and I think that's the part people leave out when they tell stories like mine. The part where you're allowed to mourn people while still refusing to let them define you anymore. So if you're watching this tonight and some part of what I've shared feels a little too familiar, a family that overlooked you, a sibling who was handed everything while you were handed excuses, a parent who chose comfort over truth, I want you to hear this clearly. You do not need their permission to matter. You do not need their apology to move forward. You do not need to wait for the version of justice you imagined as a child sitting at some kitchen table, hoping someone would finally notice everything you carried in silence. Sometimes justice doesn't look like revenge at all. Sometimes it simply looks like a life built so solidly, so honestly, on your own terms, that the people who once dismissed you can no longer deny what you were capable of all along. Thank you for staying with me through this story. If it meant something to you, if any part of it felt like your own story looking back at you, I hope you'll share it with someone who needs to hear it tonight, and I hope you'll remember this next time you're waiting on someone else to finally see your worth. Stop waiting and start building. That's how you win, not by watching them lose everything, but by becoming someone they can never take anything from again.